Sup, dude? Recently, I've been really interested in the 2000s era, specifically the great scorers of that time. Back then, the pace of play was much slower than what it is today. Teams are putting up less than 100 points a night, meanwhile nowadays the norm is well over 100. The insane bucket getting we've seen this year is cool, but nothing will ever be as aesthetic as gritty 2000s ISO ball. There were countless dudes who were raw going one-on-one. Two of my favorites are Melo and T-Mac. Those dudes are superheroes in terms of scoring. Although shaped differently, the two were pretty similar. In this video, I'm going to break down both of their scoring styles as well as compare them in order to determine who's the greater bucket getter. Let's begin by taking a look at Thickums. Melo was a dense 6'8" forward whose scoring repertoire involved a plethora of midi magicianry as well as all other types of buckets you can think of. He was a shot creator in every sense of the word. It didn't even matter if the shot he created was contested, the dude had dead eye on Hall of Fame. In the mid-range especially, his pull-up jumper was so quick dudes couldn't react. His go-to moves for getting it off were jab steps and pump fakes. If you're a big boy with a jumper, you gotta study this dude's triple threat game. He was a master of it. Despite his large frame, his fakes and shots were extremely quick and effective. He had so many ways to get a bucket that most of the time his defender was left crying for help. He gave dudes so much business with his triple threat sauce that double teams were frequently sent his way. When this happened, it was a guessing game of whether he would swing the rock or not, and the answer was usually the latter. Good thing the dude could get an open shot inside a telephone booth. In addition to his triple threat fuckery, dudes couldn't hold him in the post. His meaty frame allowed him to relentlessly smash his ass into dudes until they couldn't take it anymore. Dwight probably had dreams of Melo posting him up. Gary Harris too. His shot of choice in the post was typically his fade, but he was strong enough to bruise his way inside too. Stepping behind the arc, Melo struggled the first few years of his career shooting in the 20s, but as time passed he improved a lot. His deep bomb efficiency typically hovered around league average, but in 2014 he did have an outlier year, hitting a career high 40% of his threes. When a jump shot wasn't an option, getting to the rack was also a pretty safe bet. As I just mentioned, he had no issues posting up and pummeling his way inside, but he could also throw down. Of course he was much better at this in his younger days, but don't sleep, Chunky Melo got up too. Because he was so physical, he got fouled quite a bit. During his 20s, he averaged close to 8 attempts a night, converting over 80% of them. In his 30s, those attempts got cut in half, but he was still efficient with it. I think that pretty much covers Melo. Moving on to the lazy-eyed assassin. T-Mac's aesthetic is far different from Melo's. He was this long, lanky, athletic guard who scored effortlessly with finesse rather than power. That was kinda it for their differences though. He and Melo got buckets in a lot of the same ways. First off, his triple threat game as well as his post scoring was nasty. He frequently had defenders jumping with his long, exaggerated shot fake. It was so good because his pull-up game was elite, so defenders were always guessing. It was also super believable because he brought the ball up over his head, which is very similar to how he actually shoots. When he had a man guarding him who was smaller than him, which was usually the case because he was a 6'9" shooting guard, he would bully them with his height by flinging turnarounds they couldn't dream of reaching. His jumper was a work of art. It kind of reminds me of KD's. They both have super long limbs and can easily pull up over dudes because of how unreachable their release is. T-Mac got so high up when he shot it was ridiculous. He would jump 40 inches in the air then send that bitch to the moon. His pull-up was especially deadly when he did his signature hezzy before. The dude was like Medusa, but his hang dribble turned him to stone. He frequently pulled up from 3 too. Not so much when he was with Toronto, but when he got to Orlando, he started slinging it. Similarly to Melo, he shot long bombs with pretty average efficiency, but they looked cool as shit, so that's all that matters. Where the two differ the most is in the slashing department. While Melo was a solid finisher, T-Mac was elite. When he jumped, he hung in the air for hours and could gracefully navigate his way through contact. His ability to fly combined with his length made for some of the sickest dunks I've ever seen. The dude was a heat-seeking missile. That's it for T-Mac, I think. To determine who the overall better scorer is, I'm gonna break it down into 5 categories. To begin, let's talk about how each of their scoring impacted winning. Tracy McGrady doesn't have the best case. He famously was cursed and never made it out of the first round. Well, he did when he was way out of his prime, but that doesn't count. Although this wasn't totally his fault, he still played a part in it. You see, he wasn't very clutch and had many moments where he choked. For example, the 2005 playoffs. He and Yao got the Rockets up 2-0, but then proceeded to lose the next 3 straight because of T-Mac's endgame blunders. Then they lost the series after he went 10 for 26 in Game 7. Similarly, Melo wasn't the most successful in the postseason, but he made the conference finals in 2009 and the second round in 2013. Because of this, the point goes to Melo. Moving on to peak, this easily goes to T-Mac, because for 7 years the dude was getting compared to Kobe and being considered for MVP. Meanwhile, Melo never really reached that level. He was a superstar for a couple years, but that's kinda it. Despite this, he did have way better longevity. His prime lasted double what T-Mac's was. Because of this, he sits just outside the top 10 in all-time scoring, while T-Mac is much farther down. 1 point to both. In terms of efficiency, I want to say neither because they both took a lot of dumbass shots, but Melo's career true shooting percentage is noticeably better, so I'll give the point to him. With T-Mac down 3-1, we don't really need to look at the last category. If you're curious to know what it is, it's difficulty of shots, and honestly that goes to Melo too. He didn't care how many hands were in his face, he was gonna let it fly. Upon concluding my analysis, I can confidently say Melo was the greater scorer overall. They had very comparable styles, but Fat Boy edges him out. Speaking of edging, one time an NBA player beat his meat while driving. Click here to find out more about that as well as a few other stories. Thanks for watching this one, hope you enjoyed. Bye dude.